Well, Edward, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk to you. There's so much going on in the history space this year with America 250. So I was hoping maybe you could start out with just a brief introduction so that people that watch my show know who you are.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Ed Lengel. I'm an independent historian after a long career working, first of all, as director of the Papers of George Washington project, being a George Washington and founding era expert, and then in the public history field at a series of museums. That now I'm very happily, since the beginning of 2024, independent, and I'm more productive than I've ever been before being out of an office. I can tell you that. I've got a bunch of books coming out. My website is edwardglengel.com. You got to put the middle initial in there. I used to have a website, edwardlengel.com. That's gone, but now it's edwardglengel.com. So, you could go there and you can see the different things I do. And not only write books and do a lot of public speaking, but I also lead history tours and do a whole bunch of other stuff. I tell you, I've never been so busy in my life. I've never been working harder, and I've never been busier. I've never been more productive than when you can kind of get outside an institution and start kind of following your own interests. So we get to talk about the kind of projects that I have coming out. Each one is completely different. So that's what I am. I mean, I'm primarily a military historian, but I've done work in a lot of other fields as well. But I think from the very beginning of my career, I've been mainly interested in military history, and I know you and many of your listeners are interested in intelligence and intelligence history. There's certainly things I can talk about relating to that, including in the Revolutionary War.
Oh, I'd love to hear all about that. I think it's interesting that you're independent, saying you're working more than ever before. I definitely recommend people check out your website because you just have a great body of work there and tons of books. Check out his books. But let's start there. Let's start with the American Revolution because this is America 250. This is the year,
Yes.
uh, you know, 250 years since the founding of the country. I think it's a big deal to make it this far without it completely collapsing yet, and I hope it doesn't. Can you maybe like set the landscape for us a little bit? Um, the more I read about the revolution and our founding fathers, the more I realize I know nothing. I just know nothing, right? And I think
Yeah.
probably most people are. You know what was the thing I think about a lot in regards to history is the feeling, I guess you could say, the vibe of the era, because I can think back to like September 11th around that time, and I experienced that, so I understand the way things felt as a
Yes.
country. And it and I think about that a lot, like, how did it feel back then? What were the things that led to, ultimately the revolution? Like, what was the vibe back then?
Yeah, well, there are two things he said, Nick, that I want to kind of latch onto. One is not knowing anything about it, coming into it not knowing anything about it is not necessarily a bad thing. And I really mean that because you come into it, what it means is when you come into it, you don't have preconceptions and the preconditioning that many people do, that they expect this is what I'm supposed to know or this is what I'm supposed to believe. You can come at it fresh. And actually, I have direct experience of that because my PhD actually is in Irish and British history, 19th and 20th century. That's what I got at University of Virginia is where I got it, and I was working as part-time undergraduate, not graduate, part-time graduate student assistant at the Washington Papers, which is a project involved in publishing, editing and publishing all of his letters. And I went in there not knowing anything about the founding era. I mean, I took one class in my first year of undergraduate school in early American history. That was it, right? So I had to come in from outside and learn about it. And actually, that was a big help to me when I wrote. And it's another story. When I wrote my first book about George Washington, which is General George Washington: A Military Life, with Random House, I talked to a professor who was a George Washington expert, had been running the project for a long time.
Mhm.
Bill Abbott was his name. And I said, Bill, I feel really insecure writing this book about George Washington because that's not my background. He said, it's an advantage. He said, because you're not caught up in all the little academic debates and teapot tempests, he
Yeah.
called them.
Mm.
And there's a hell of a lot of that now. So it's good to come into it fresh. That's the one thing. And then the next thing you spoke about, the feel and the vibe, is also really important to latch on to that because it is something that pulls you in and I think gives you a sense of empathy and sympathy for your subject. I think anybody who goes into history, it's really important to reach for that feeling and it's really important to reach for that vibe. If you kind of sit back and you look at it clinically and you try to separate yourself from it, you're not going to understand it. And I think that's one reason a lot of people misunderstand our history right now is because they tend to look at it from a distance and they judge it
Right.
by our standards. And they say, oh, look at all the naughty things those people did. And they don't get into the feeling. How did it feel at the time? So to answer your question, I came at it by a roundabout way.
Mhm.
The feeling, the feeling at the time was one of incredible ferment, right? If we talk about, say, 1775, 1776, incredible ferment, incredible passion, incredible emotion. And there was a widespread belief early in the war. We talked 250 years ago now, and among the founders too, and most of them, that of just wild optimism and wild hope that our unity and our belief and our togetherness is what's going to win this war against Great Britain. That was the feel, that was the vibe. And it took somebody like George Washington um, to have a more realistic assessment and to step back and to say, hey, wait a second, we can't win this war in emotion. We can't win this war in passion. We gotta be cold and calculating and tough about it, and recognize it's gonna take a lot of sacrifice and it's gonna involve a lot of pain. But I think I often said, like, I went into this subject not knowing anything about Washington, and in fact, being a little bit inclined to say, oh, this is boring stuff because I liked other things, right? But when you look at them and you really see them as people, I am just such a huge fan now because I think nobody else could have done what he did.
Why
He
do you
was
say that?
because there are a lot of things, and one I think it's a really important fact to note. He was a combat veteran, right? And that's not just, oh well, yeah, he was a combat veteran, but he was a combat veteran, and think about that. He had a firsthand knowledge of war. He had a firsthand knowledge of war from many different levels, from the command perspective, but also from the service perspective, the boots on the ground, the sharp end of the spear perspective. So he understood in ways that nobody else did. Not Jefferson, not Madison, not John Adams, not anybody among the founders. He was the only one who understood war at all levels and what it involves, from the fighting man in the field to the logistics to the administration to the intelligence, which we can talk about, although that he had to feel his way there. um, but simply nobody else could have done that. You can go through those lists of founders, and and big people, including some who had been military men, and none of them had the tools that he had and the skills that he had. None of them, not even close. So
So is
we
it
owe a
safe
lot to
to
that
say, like,
guy.
is it safe to say that if we didn't have George Washington, likely no revolution?
Well, I think we would have had a revolution, but we likely would have been defeated. Or, you can talk about different types of defeat and different types of victory. Um, I often think like the alternative to what we actually got in 1783 is what the people of South and Central America got in about 1819, 1820, 1821, which was a whole bunch of warring republics and dictatorships and monarchies and everything who were all, they found their independence, but they found it in a chaotic, devastating kind of way, and they ended up fighting wars against each other and with no tradition of democracy for right up to the present day. And we could very well have gone the same way had it not been for somebody who could keep the cause and the nation together and achieve victory in a certain way that was always on his mind. It's not victory at all costs, but it's victory preserving the nation and preserving the nation's ability to prosper. I think that was the key. He was the guy who always kept in mind why we fight. Why do we go into this war? We certain objectives, and we have to keep those objectives in mind all the way through and never step away from them. Um,
And I'll tell
and
you,
I think so many others were willing to quit on that. He did not.
as a veteran and someone that spent a lot of time around the military, what you just said there about Washington maintaining the objectives,
Yeah,
that's a lot easier said than done,
yeah.
because anytime you're working on any type of large scale operation, you've heard the term mission creep, mission creep
Hmm.
deep in, and then all of a sudden other things might seem more important, but like somebody that has that vision and that guiding principle, that's really important. And I think now the thought of the Washington Monument, just this huge thing staying there, the pillar of strength, seems more appropriate. But I wanted to ask about, so they signed the Declaration of Independence, right? It's on at this point. Um, did the people that signed the Declaration of Independence, did they really know? Like you just mentioned that Washington was the only one that understood war
Hmm.
to a certain extent. Did they have any idea what they were getting into?
No. No, they didn't. They didn't have any idea what they were getting into. Um, and to follow up on the point that you made, keeping the objectives and sticking to the objectives and the purpose, absolutely. But being adaptable and flexible in the means of achieving
Mhm.
those objectives was also something he was able to do. He was not rigid. So, for example, we could talk about Yorktown at some point, but that he was fixated on a certain like strategic and tactical means of achieving that objective, and he thought there was one way to do it, and he thought that way for years. But then when an opportunity presented itself, like here's a once in a lifetime concordance of what happened at Yorktown. I mean, those things are almost miraculous. And he said, okay, I got to scrap everything that I've been focused on for years. Here's our opportunity. We're going to take it. Right. So that was the way he thought. Now, in terms of like what you were asking about at the time of the Declaration of Independence, nobody understood what they were getting into. And I go back to 75 as well, the Second Continental Congress. They were so carried away with the sense of unity. We're all together. We believe in the same thing. And they really believed that the people of America, the people, will rise up. The idea of the farmer who picks up his musket and goes off and fires a few shots at the enemy, and the enemy runs away, and then you can just, okay, I'm going to put the musket back up on the shelf, and I'm going to come home and plow my fields. They really believed that would work. And so they didn't, for the most part, understand that this was going to be a tough effort that requires organization, that requires dedication, that requires sacrifice. Um, the vast majority of them had no understanding of that. And they got a whipping.
Sure.
In 76, they got a whipping. Um, all through that year, Washington included, because so many people didn't understand. There was a whole series of defeats. Um, and I was fortunate that he had the long-term view to be able to pull things together.
You mentioned Yorktown. What was the thing that Washington realized?
So he had been for let me step back. One of the things that he from the very beginning believed and recognized, he believed the war had to be ended as quickly as possible. The idea that Washington wanted a guerrilla war, that he thought he could outlast the enemy and what, that's all a myth. That's not true. He thought a long war is a war that we're going to lose because the British have more staying power than we do, economically and politically and everything else. Long story, but I can talk about that another time. But he believed he got to end the war quickly. He was always looking for that one big battle that was going to do it. And the British occupied New York in 76 and held on to it. And that was their main center of power in North America throughout the duration of the war. Washington became obsessed by 1778. He became obsessed with the idea that we're going to launch this massive all out assault on New York City. It's going to be devastating. It's going to be bloody. A lot of people are going to die. New York will probably be burned to the ground. It already was partially burned. But we're gonna get everybody together. We're going to assault New York. So when France enters the war, Washington spends all his time trying to convince them, bring your fleet off New York, blockade New York, keep the British Navy out, and then we'll launch our attack. I'm oversimplifying, but that was his idea. Now, in the summer of 1781, and the French are saying, yeah, 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 we'll do that. That's fine. And Rochambeau comes with his French troops, and they come down, and they're outside New York, and Washington's outside New York, and it's like, we're getting everything together. We're going to attack. And then, lo and behold, the French appear off the Virginia Capes to blockade Cornwallis, who has just arrived at Yorktown with a large British force after campaigning in the South. And for the one time in history, the French fleet defeats the British fleet. That just doesn't happen. But it happens here. They have naval superiority. And Washington looks at it and he realizes the French have misled him. They lied. No, they were saying they're going to appear off New York. They're like, no, that's a stupid idea. We're going to go down off Virginia anyway. Washington could have said, this is terrible. This is outrageous. Like, we're going to attack New York. You need to get back up here. This is what we've been planning for years. But no, he decides in a snap, and he has to make the decision immediately. This is one of the great command moments, leadership moments. I got to drop everything except reality. This is the opportunity. We're going down to Yorktown. And there's an intelligence aspect of this too, because there's I did an essay on Washington and intelligence and the Continental Army several years ago. A collection of essays from people at the National Ground Intelligence Center, and it opened my eyes. Like, at the beginning of the war, there's internal, there's external intelligence. He he had no idea what the enemy was doing. He had no idea, where they were. He had no kind of a system of
Right.
gathering and analyzing intelligence. He didn't know where his own troops were. He didn't know his own capacity in 76. By 1781, he knows all of it. So he can, when he hears that a French fleet has arrived, they defeated the British, right? We have an opportunity here. He can immediately pull out the information he needs and he can say, here are our assets. Here's where we have them. Here's how we can move them. Here's how long it would take. And here's where the enemy is. Here are their assets. Here are their intentions. I mean, he can't read their mail, so to speak, but he has a very astute and thorough understanding of what to do. You can't make a smart command decision if you don't have good intelligence. So,
So that's what, now we call that C2, command and control. Might hear C4, which gets into the intelligence aspect of it. So what does he do to set up that command and control? Like how does he go from knowing nothing to knowing everything?
yeah, it's a great story. It's a long story. I'll just point out a few elements. Is one, establish a system, an actual process with people in charge, people who report to him, and clear lines of control of his intelligence system, right? Guidelines for how it will work. And you got to realize this guy's an amateur in this subject. He's really an amateur. He's proceeding by instinct, but he has a passion for organization. So create an effective system, put the right people in the right place, and convince Congress and others to provide them the assets that they need to carry out their work. Because in 76, everything is slapdash, in terms of what's the enemy doing? Well, I don't know. Where are their ships? I have no idea. Where are their troops? How much weaponry do they have? What are they trying to do? I know. I met this guy out on the road, and he said he can slip into New York and he can tell me what they're doing. Okay, why don't you go do that? And then you come back and you give me a letter and that. What do you think? You think we can trust him? Yeah, sure. you know, or well, maybe not. And that's kind of how things work, right? Or we'll send out some cavalry, or we'll do a few other things. It's ironic that he develops this system as part of an aspect of his obsession with attacking New York. There was a TV series called Turn that was out
Mhm.
some years ago. You might remember it, about the Culper spy ring and all that spies in the revolution. What that actually was a process of trial and error and development of a system of intelligence that would be applied to finding out what the British are doing in New York and how the hell we're going to get in there to defeat them. It was all part of an effort to find out how to carry out that grand plan of attacking New York. So a lot of trial and error, a lot of working with junior officers and subordinates, and knowing how to pick the right people to create a system. And the difference was profound, the, over 5 years, given that he was doing it from scratch. There's actually a system by 81 for gathering and assessing intelligence.
Well, that's impressive, especially at that scale. Especially when you think about what you talked about with the, you know, loosey goosey human intelligence of
Yeah.
people
It's
that can
fun to
get
read. It's fun to read those in early intelligence letters. You're like, what the hell were these people thinking?
right. That's wild. So okay, so he organizes command and control. Um, what are the big events that lead up to victory? Like what are the big, I don't know, three or four things that happen that were major shifts in that war?
Well, first of all, I just did an Audible original, which will be coming out this December, called the 10 Days to Victory, which is about the crossing of the Delaware, the battles of Trenton and Princeton. And Christmas night, 1776 to January 3rd, 1777, Washington's finest tactical moment. Uh, Most people know about the crossing of the Delaware, and the surprise attack on Trenton on the German troops there. And that was a big turnaround moment because there had been so many defeats before that. His army was falling apart. That's a long story, but what that proceeded from was Washington's recognition that for all the passion and belief and drama that had gone into making the revolution, declaring independence, that people are people. And he wrote a letter shortly before that crossing of the Delaware where he said, I've got to face the fact that interest, by which he means self-interest, is the governing human principle. You have to see that. You have to recognize that. You can't just be like, we believe it. You got to realize people are beginning to say this war isn't worth it. Civilians, right? Women, parents, grandparents, siblings, home at the farm, home at the, shop, being
Mhm.
able to say, hey, John or Richard, you know, you should just come home. Just, we're done. And so many people are like resigning, leaving the military, deserting, whatever. His army is dissolving. He says this, we got to turn around public human opinion to get people believing in the war again. That's why he crossed the Delaware, to change the whole dynamic and the feel, right? And he succeeded in that. So that's one. The other one, I like to point out and hear from a leadership and command perspective is Valley Forge. Um, the Army at the end of 77 goes into this encampment at Valley Forge. Again, they've been defeated multiple times, and they go into this terrible encampment way out in the middle of nowhere. There's nothing there. There's nothing at Valley Forge. There's a few farms around, there's some woods. There's plenty of water and wood. That's pretty much it. And they go into this encampment and they deal with these total logistical breakdown. I mean, supplies are not coming in, no inadequate clothing, inadequate food, especially inadequate shelter. Guys are starting to die of disease. The hospitals are terrible. Long story short, what does a good leader do at a time like that when you've suffered defeats in the field? Your guys still want to fight, but they're like, what are we doing in this encampment? We're just sitting here, and it wasn't really that cold. It was more like hovering around freezing, but lots of precipitation. Um, so what does a good leader do? I've talked to many people about this, from military groups to civilian groups and, leadership groups and children. What does a good leader do? Do you give a big speeches? Do you put on your best uniform and ride your white horse through camp and wave your sword and say, "Well, get them next time"? Do you go out looking for like this moment of crisis, little pinprick victories? Do you look for your own glory, or do you, like Washington, getting back again, understand soldiers because he's been there? What do these guys want? What do these
Yeah.
guys want? They want to know that you're taking care of them. They want to know that you're not working for your own like glory. You're not working for the soldiers are not there to prop him up and make him look great, but he is a service oriented leader who's going to do the ugly, necessary work to get them food, to get them shelter, to get them clothing, to get them better hospitals, to get them what they need. And it's not a simple aha moment, but it's like sitting there at his desk day after day, night after night, working his ass off and not leaving camp to get them what they need. And him with some other officers who support him. It's not all him. Lots of officers quit, but people like Nathaniel Greene, Henry Knox, and many others, they stick by him. Light Horse Harry Lee, they do that tough work to get the food in. That is the transition moment from the servicemen saying, okay, we'll follow him because he's our commander in chief, to we love this guy. We'll walk with him to the gates of hell because he recognizes we're out there. We may lose our lives. We understand that. We can get wounded. We can lose our lives. We could catch disease. That's what we are. We're soldiers. That can happen. But we know that he's going to give us everything we could possibly need so that we know any sacrifice we have to make is not pointless. There's always that negotiation. When you look at the battles after Valley Forge, moments start happening like a Battle of Monmouth in the summer of 1778, where Washington is not in command of the army at the very beginning. He has other officers who are leading them. And there's some mix-ups on the battlefield, and the troops get misaligned, and they retreat at the beginning of the battle. For the first time this happened, Washington rides up. He appears. They see him. He doesn't say a word. The retreat stops. He's there. We're not retreating anymore. And there were many accounts of saying it was like he appeared as an electric effect. Because there'd been battles before that when men were retreating and Washington would show up and they just keep on retreating. But after Valley Forge, the evidence is clear.
Yeah.
That's where he earned the love of his army. So I see those moments, and then of course Yorktown we talked about as being the great moments of the war.
What a great story. Because
Yeah,
anyone that served in the military can tell you, you know, you learn two things in the military, two things for certain. It's you learn what good leadership is and you learn what bad leadership is. For
yeah,
certain. You're going to
I'm
see that
sure.
because there's so many instances where you need to have leadership. So many different things you're doing, whether you're moving somewhere, training, whatever. You need to have leadership. So
Yeah,
you get to witness that. And I've always believed that the leaders that roll up their sleeves and get in there with maybe they're not doing, the heavy lifting, but they're there with the troops doing the stuff, suffering with them. They're the best. They're
yeah.
always the best. And it sounds like he was that type of leader. Like he
Yeah,
was.
you know that if you're in the field and you don't have what you need
Mhm.
in order to perform at your highest capacity, you need a leader who's going to get the job done. Right? You like physical courage. You like he can share your hardships. That's important. Physical courage is important, but he's got to do his job, right? And there have been many leaders throughout history, as and as I can see as a historian, military leaders, like, they think, oh, I got to lead from the front, right? So they're out there running around the battlefield. And I've seen so many cases where, the servicemen don't always say it, but they're saying it to each other, like, get your ass out of here, get back to headquarters and do your job. Because you're there for a purpose, right? You're not there to be out here I am, I'm at the front. You're there for a purpose to be sitting, you know, at your desk, or now in modern times, or, in front of a screen or at the phone or whatever. You just got to be quiet. You got to do your job because we got a job to do. You got a job to do. Um, and that goes right back. That was his attitude. Yeah, he'd be there. He was incredibly physically brave. He would not flinch when a bullet went flying by, and he'd been under fire, and he was under fire during the Revolution, and miraculously, never wounded, but he was there. People saw him, but he knew that he needed to be in control and doing his job. And that's leadership, I think.
It sounds like it. Um, so go through the American Revolution. When does Washington realize that things are going good for them? That things are looking up, like there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Um, that's a funny question. I'm laughing because I want to say never. Like, he doesn't let himself relax. Not really until the war is over. He doesn't let himself relax.
Okay.
And there are dramas and things that happen, and toward the end of the war, there's a moment in March of 1783 at Newburgh, New York, another great moment in our history where there's been disaffection and people are trying to convince officers to lead the men to march on Congress, to get Congress to give the servicemen what they need and pensions and all of that. And Washington intervenes to stop that. It's an amazing moment. Washington is always afraid that the war could resume, but then he's concerned at the very end of the war, the way he puts it, when he finally realizes, okay, Treaty of Paris is negotiated, the war is ending. Um, he doesn't kick back and relax, but he believed that, and I always try to state this carefully because I don't want to be misunderstood. He believed that he had a role to play. He had a script to follow that was ordained from the very beginning of the war. The nation was created, independence was declared with a certain goal in view and with a certain morality to it, which was the civilian authority is always supreme, will always be supreme. Otherwise, we shouldn't have gotten in this war in the first place. Right. So at the very end, he's concerned, like, I have to do everything just right because everybody's going to watch to see what I do. There was no kind of hand wringing. Well, should I become king? Should I become dictator? Should I, do this or that? For Washington, there was only one thing he could do, and that was to return his commission. And that was what Congress expected. He goes to Annapolis to return his commission. The delegates are very careful. They don't ask him to give it back. They don't stand. They don't applaud. They just sit there. Okay, do your duty, give it back. And they don't even smile at him. And he comes and his hands are shaking. And he reads his farewell speech, and he's got tears streaming out of his eyes, but his hands are shaking. Everybody saw that, and the delegates are just sitting there. They're not helping him at all. And he gives back his commission. He resigns his commission. He goes home. They don't even say bye, George. They don't even say thanks a lot, George. They just sit there and they take it. Okay. And he goes. He doesn't really relax until, I always thought, as a soldier, the finest thing. That's how I ended my General George Washington book. He gets home right at Christmas. That's when he gets back to Mount Vernon. There's snow on the ground, everything, and Martha's waiting on the porch. Um, but that's the only time he let himself relax, was then.
So he gives up his commission. What the first election, was there an election that occurred? I actually don't exactly know this. Yeah, I know obviously he was the first president, but was there a democratic election that occurred and he was nominated? Like, how did that process work?
Yeah, there was an election in quotes. It was really an acclamation.
Gotcha.
There were no opponents. There was no rivalry. It was understood from the very beginning that he was going to be president. He was chosen by universal choice, um, and he accepted it. Didn't really want to, but he did. It was 1789. I always think an amazing aha moment for me there was that uh, right before he goes into the presidency, he writes a private letter to somebody. I can't remember who he wrote it to now. He says to build and foster the national prosperity shall be my first and only aim. That's it. Uh, and that is like, talk about focus, single-minded focus, and he keeps to that, because I've got to build a nation that is strong, that can become prosperous, or people can work, to build a prosperous country, and he sticks to that as president. Um, and there are lots of different things that go into that, but that's his goal.
So at this point, at the after the war, is he basically like a superhero? Like, does everybody know who this person is? And like, is that the type of aura he has?
Yeah, it is. Um, it fades for a while,
Hmm.
and
Okay.
it fades toward the end of his first term, the beginning of his second term. Uh, in the 1792, 1793, 4 to 5. Um, People think our country is politically divided now, and I think the only comparison they make might be the 1960s. Dude, the 1790s were worse. Much worse. And given that the nation was so young and fragile, it could have destroyed the country. And in fact, Washington did not want a second term of the presidency. He was talked into it, actually, by a woman who was a friend of his, Eliza Willing Powell. And they were just friends. There was nothing, else going on. But he really looked up to her, and she said, "Look, you have to come back for the country, because Hamilton and Jefferson are going to tear this thing apart if you don't come back." And so he comes back, and Jefferson says, "Okay, I'm done with government. I'm leaving." He tells Washington, "I'm going to go back to Monticello, and I'm not getting involved in politics anymore," which was a lie. Yeah. I'm a big Washington fan. I think Jefferson was brilliant. I think Jefferson did so many things for our nation. But man, he was a snake.
What's he
The guy
really?
was a snake.
That's
And
crazy. Okay. Interesting.
he was a politician. Jefferson is a politician. Washington was not. Jefferson was a politician, and Jefferson whips up this kind of slanderous um, movement to defame Washington. And he supports this newspaper called the Aurora, which was a radical newspaper, because Jefferson was a radical. He thought the French Revolution, they're 1792, the guillotines are working overtime. Jefferson is, yeah, you know, you can't get an omelet without breaking eggs. So kill off all the aristocrats. That's cool. Do it. Um, so Jefferson supports this radical newspaper that starts defaming Washington and slandering him. They issue these fake letters that they claim are from Washington from the Revolutionary War, saying he really loved King George III. They're fakes. Jefferson knew this. Jefferson supported it. And people begin to believe some of this stuff. And when Washington in 1795 gets a treaty with the British to kind of keep the peace, there are people going out, screaming for Washington's head. So 1797, he's done. He retires from the presidency, and he says, I'm never going back. He said, I'm disgusted with politics. Let John Adams handle it. I don't want any more to do with this.
But that's interesting the way you put that, because I've always thought of that moment, and I think the common conception is that he relinquished the presidency as to not to consolidate power. Is that inaccurate?
He relinquished the presidency. I mean, there was an example there to be said. He understood the precedent of not going for a third term, but he wouldn't even consider it personally.
Oh, I see. He
He
hated
had,
the
and
lack of.
he knew he was also approaching the end of his life. He knew that he was fading. Jefferson would have these meetings with Washington when he was still in the cabinet, and Jefferson would be, "Yes, Mr. President. Yes, you're right, Mr. President." Then he would go leave the room and he'd write down in his diary, the president is failing mentally. He's not all there, and starts whispering to other people he's not all there. And Washington is all there, but he's also clearly, approaching the end. And he is fading. Not to the point of incapacity, but he's beginning to lose his capacity, and he's seeing it seep away. And he's like, I can't stay. And he steps away. I think because he also knows he's just simply physically not up to it.
Man, I feel like I've heard this story somewhere before.
I know.
Uh,
History always provides great examples for the present.
um, I think it's safe to. I mean, it sounds like Thomas Jefferson was the pushing the original fake news. And you see that tactic
Yeah,
all the time. You
yeah,
can if you just pay a little bit of attention, you can see where politicians will to this day, this is what they do. They'll take something they know is not true and they lie knowing they're lying. And it just oh man, it just
yeah,
I understand why somebody of immense integrity would see that and just be disgusted with it because
yeah,
that's the thing. I don't know. Every time I see that, I get this sick feeling in my stomach, like watching somebody lie and they know they're lying and they're lying. It
yeah.
just makes me feel disgusting. Basically, it's like, oh,
Yeah,
these,
there's nothing new under the sun, Nick.
yeah,
I mean, I think Washington wasn't above the misdirection or the fib, and a leader can never be completely forthcoming about everything, but he nevertheless, in everything that mattered, he tried to maintain total integrity. And I make another comparison. I think one of our greatest modern presidents is Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a lot like Washington as president too, in that he really tried to maintain the personal integrity. But he also understood, like when that U-2 spy plane went over, yeah, he got shot down. He lied about it, um, because he had to.
yeah, he had to.
Sometimes it's a matter of policy. But Jefferson would, I don't think Jefferson was evil, but Jefferson would lie out of instinct.
He was playing the game, playing
He
the game,
played, yeah,
playing the game.
yeah.
Well, I mean, I think that's. Thank you so much for that, like rundown on Washington, the Revolution. But I want to be respectful of your time. And I got some other things I'd like to ask you about.
Yeah, we
Um,
can talk a little while longer. I'm fine with
okay,
that.
awesome, awesome. So I wanted to ask about and this might be kind of a rough switch, but the Medal of Honor. I mean, this is we just saw uh, Chief Warrant Officer 5 receive the Medal of Honor at the State of the Union address for piloting an aircraft after he'd been shot, and like every single one of these Medal of Honor stories is the best story you've ever heard. Like
Yeah,
every single one of them is like someone's wounded and they go in, they pick up their um, fellow soldier or whatever, and they drag him out. And it's just every single time I'm just, you know, astonished by these stories. Um, and given your work with the uh, Medal of Honor, is it the Medal of Honor Foundation? Is that what it
yeah,
was?
yeah.
And we could talk about that, but I'm interested about like what's the wildest Medal of Honor story that sticks out to you?
Well, so I just finished a biography of Audie Murphy, which hopefully is going to be coming out late this year. And I got to know Audie Murphy's family, who all live. I live near Dallas Fort Worth region, and his son's passed away over the last couple of years, but he's got a bunch of nieces living in this area, and I've gotten to know many of them. So I've kind of been immersed in his story. The other story I've been immersed in is Alvin York from World War One, because he's a cousin of mine.
Wow,
Um,
really?
my my mom on my mom's side are actually pretty closely related. So I've always been interested in him as well, and my book Never in Finer Company was about um, three Medal of Honor recipients from that war: Alvin York, George McMurtry, and Charles Whittlesey. Charles Whittlesey and George McMurtry with the Lost Battalion, and then York was involved in rescuing the Lost Battalion. Um, and I became immersed in their stories, and now I've become immersed in Audie Murphy's story. And I find the Medal of Honor, and I've gotten to know a lot of Medal of Honor recipients. I knew, for example, I knew Woody Williams pretty well, the last living World War II recipient. That guy was all Marine. He was he was Marine from top of his head to the tip of his toes. He was a wonderful man, but very, very much just a regular guy. And I find something just so inspiring in all of these recipients, because I think what they do is they speak to the potential in all of us. I love what Audie Murphy did on top of that burning tank destroyer at Holtzwihr in January 26, 1945. Um, and he tells his men to go back, get under cover. Germans are attacking tanks, infantry, and everything, and he calls for artillery. Then he climbs on top of that American tank destroyer that's been burning. He's got dead men next to him, and he gets behind that 30 cal and you know holds the Germans off. Uh, there's another example of that in World War One. A guy named Jack Barkley, who is scouting. He's a scout. He sees a German regiment level attack, infantry attack about to go in. He's the only guy there. He finds a German machine gun nearby with some ammunition. He sees a tank that's been knocked out, a French tank. These old tanks, it's got actually a hatch, a turret that has kind of an open, gun um, kind of slot. Barclay goes over there and he gets in that tank and he sticks a machine gun through the front. And by himself, he shoots down dozens of Germans and holds them off. They're firing artillery pieces at him and they're throwing grenades. They're doing all this stuff, and he survives. Those stories they're just phenomenal. They're just phenomenal. Each and every one of them. And you have to love. You have to have a tremendous love. And I think the metal has, especially in the modern era, maintained its integrity of the process, that the reviewers are politics do get in,
Sure.
right? Even any Medal of Honor recipient will tell you that. I know one living Medal of Honor recipient who fought in Afghanistan, and his medal was held up.
Mhm.
He knows it because he criticized a superior officer for not providing artillery support during his action. His medal was held up for years before it finally went through. So, they know that happens, but nevertheless, the integrity of the process is pretty sacrosanct, and that principle above and beyond the call of duty has been maintained. And you can look at these guys, and some people are kind of gainsaying and questioning, or is the president just giving these medals, for political reasons? No, there's a process,
Yeah.
and the process says, yeah, they're not the guys who do this, and men and women, I'm sure both involved now, Uh, they don't hand these things out as political favors.
Yeah, and
They
I hope it stays that way because anybody
Yes.
that served in the military will tell you that the awards process is always a little strange, right? I was in Iraq in 2005, and they just like gave out awards based on whatever your rank was. Like, oh, okay,
Well, Audie
thanks. Grab
Murphy,
medal, thank you.
Audie Murphy was very bitter,
Yeah,
and he threw his medal away,
huh?
Medal of Honor, and his other medals too.
Why?
His bitterness was, you're giving me these medals, and all these other guys deserved it, and all they got was a wooden cross. And the guy who, I think, and I'm kind of channeling Audie Murphy now, is that the guy next to me said, "I'm gonna take that machine gun," and he stood up and he got shot in the head. He deserved the Medal of Honor just every bit as much as I did. And I think there was a lot of that kind of mentality, and other recipients have shared it too. Uh,
Okay, I mean, I guess if
that was his point of view, you
yeah,
know. Um, but he got another one made. There are actually a few medals, Audie Murphy medals of honor out there. But he had a love-hate relationship with it.
okay, I guess I could get that struggle. I'm definitely in the camp that not everybody needs a medal. You know,
Yeah. Yeah.
if any medal should have a good process, it's that one. I mean, all the other awards. I mean, I'm telling you, everybody that served the military will tell you this. It's kind of nonsense. But that
Yeah.
one, just
Yeah.
make that one a really good one, and I'll be happy. I'll be happy.
Yeah, I mean, in the early history of the Medal of Honor, there are a lot of medals given for not good reasons. uh,
Well,
they were given out for political reasons as favors in the early days, up till World War One, really. But the system has been in place since World War One. I won't say it's perfect, but I trust it.
does the Medal of Honor Foundation play a role in any of that, or
No, they're more in the Medal of Honor Society, which I
okay,
hugely admire. And they've been under a lot of pressure from others who are trying to take away their independence, and who want to kind of. There are people who trade on the Medal of Honor for money. Audie Murphy knew that. Lots of others who know that trade on the Medal of Honor for money, as a branding thing or to get attention for themselves. The Medal of Honor Society has managed to maintain its independence, and they are of recipients and for recipients and their families. And they're all about taking care of the recipients. Um, but they don't play a role in deciding who gets the medal. That is something that is highly, I don't know how to say it, but they're very complex and precise procedures in place within the military in the reviews process.
yeah, you said that people use the Medal of Honor as a I don't know what do you call it, virtue signal,
Yeah.
virtue signaling for money.
Well,
You have any example?
I titled my book on Audie Murphy, "Make a Hero," and it comes from a line in a book, novelette by a guy named Glendon Swartout, and the line was, "When you make a hero, can you unmake him?" And in his mind, and that's true, the Medal of Honor recipients hate to be called heroes. They don't like that. And I totally believe in that. And they also don't like being called winners. They don't say Medal of Honor winner, you're a recipient. But when Audie Murphy came home, there are other people for profit, their own profit, who worked to turn him into a hero,
Oh, I see,
to make him into something,
like a brand.
a brand. And they also created Now think about this, and I think a lot of veterans would sympathize with this, and it would hit them hard, actually. They deliberately tried to create a persona of Audie as a guy who never heals, as a guy who's always about to snap. They
Yeah.
liked that. They liked, if you look in his eyes, you can see he's a killer, right? And they would feed stuff to the media saying, we're always having to hold him back because he could kill anybody right now. He's a born killer. And his nerves are shot and he's got all these problems. Um, they liked that because it sold movie tickets. And they deliberately victimized him, in my opinion. And in many ways ruined his life after the war. They didn't let him heal. They didn't let him come home. They victimized him for profit. And there are a lot of people who did that. The hangers on and from the media people, the movie people, the book people, and the false friends who wanted something out of him, and they never wanted him to just become a regular guy again, which is what he wanted. He just wanted to be a regular guy again. Um, and that's something he was not allowed to do. So I find that personally revealing. And I think all the Audie Murphy's family has said for years, they said, everybody's saying, they talk about Audie Murphy, they always say, oh, didn't he have really bad PTSD? Didn't he have all these problems?
Yeah.
And I say, we're tired of hearing about that.
Yeah.
He was a good man. And he was. So judge him by who he wanted to be. He wanted to be a great father. He wanted to be a great husband. He wanted to be a regular citizen. And for a lot of different reasons, he wasn't allowed to do that. He was manipulated. But look at him as he is, and it's true. A lot of these Medal of Honor recipients, they're regular people.
Right. And,
So
and you bring up an interesting thing that I wanted to ask you about, which is, you know, you talk about a lot of politics at play with like the Medal of Honor. I'm sure this is you mentioned earlier about how Jefferson was spinning the media for his purposes. All of this is it's a lot of noise, right?
mhm,
It's what my friend Scott Mann calls the churn. It's like the
right.
churn of uh, what creates belief in people, right? The zeitgeist. Um, I'm getting to the question. It
Yeah,
might
sure.
take me a second. Uh, history. Not a lot of people have a good, solid understanding of history. Me included. I'll readily admit that. I try. The more I realize I know nothing. Um, but what makes it? How do we know what is true in history? This is the thing that drives me crazy. Is I have a tough time grasping history that's related to me, American history, all these things, let alone world history, right? Things that happened way before America was even a thing. How do we actually know what is true? And then how does the truth actually become the zeitgeist?
Mhm.
It bothers me. I'll stay up at night thinking about this.
Well, for not being a historian, I think you've asked kind of the one big question that I think is the critical question. And it's so I actually congratulate you on that, because that's a very important thing. But I'm trying to think of a way to say this really concisely because I don't want to, go on for a long time. Um, this is a debate that has roiled historians and people who are interested in history forever. And recently, say over the past 30 to 40 years, there's been a big movement that's pretty much taken over the academy of saying we're basically giving up.
Mm,
There is no truth, there is no reality. Everything is a construct. Everything is what we make it to be. We just use words to define things that aren't real. Those are the postmodernists. I can't begin to say how much I despise them and that point of view, because they use it to justify all kinds of lies and all kinds of manipulation. And I think it has become to dominate. It has poisoned the academy in a way that has done almost irreparable harm, and has turned so many people off from history. So leaving that aside, I mean, I could go on endlessly about why that's garbage, but it has taken over the academy. I mean, just about every professor in the academy, is one reason I'm so glad to be out, has at least bends the knee to that. And it got to the point where people were saying the Holocaust didn't happen
mm,
because it's all a construct. I mean, I saw this.
crazy, crazy.
And it shows you how insane it becomes. But so to get to your question, what do I think? I see myself, and I should probably conclude with this. I'm a humanist historian. I believe in humanity. I believe in the human race, and I believe that the best way to study history is to embrace your humanity, be a human, and realize you're studying other human beings, and to do the hard work, do the research, the evidence. Gather as much evidence as you can. Don't key it into AI, for God's sake. But just like do the work and read the evidence and process it. But here's the key: how do you know what's true and how do you know what's not true? Sometimes it's hard to tell. It's often hard to tell. But trust your humanity and your human instincts. If every time before you read a history book or before you go to approach history, say, I want to learn about this, begin by going into the bathroom and looking in the mirror for a while and saying, when I study this, I am studying myself, humanity as a human being, because people are people. People have always been people, and they do certain things, and certain patterns are always followed. There's a great British historian named Sir Kenneth Clarke, and he produced uh, when BBC did good documentaries back in the 1960s, he did this documentary called Civilization, which I still think is one of the finest documentaries ever made. And he said one line I always remember, he said, history is ourselves. So empathy, as I say, if you have empathy, doesn't mean approve everything. It doesn't mean agree with everything. It doesn't mean you can't say somebody was a bad person or somebody was a good person. But you can recognize what makes people do good things, what makes people do bad things. The things that made those Medal of Honor recipients do the great things they did, that spark is in me. That spark is in you. That spark is in everybody. What made these people do terrible things, including the Nazis, the Soviets, you know, people like Mao, that spark is in me too. So you have to be willing to see that, and then you can say, does that ring true? Does that not ring true? Often you can just you do the hard work, you do the research, but then you have to let your instinct key in. If you identify with your subject and you don't hold yourself separate from it, and you're not wagging your finger and saying, look at those bad people, what they did, and now I would never do that. But you say, oh yeah, I could see myself doing that in a heartbeat, and I'm glad that I'm not, because I gotta focus on being a good person. Reach for the good spark and deny the bad spark. I think that's how you find out what really happened. You can tell. You can tell if you follow your gut along with the research, I think. So,
And then the question from there is, how does that become the zeitgeist? I mean, how does that become part of the broader understanding of history? That's we
yeah.
individuals maybe can do what you're talking about, like approach a subject with humility, but when our popular culture is filled with social media personalities and this and that, and there's just so much crap out there,
Yeah.
how do and if I'm sure I can't imagine what goes through your head when you see some of these things that people say. Um, if it's anything like mine, I'm going like, "This person's a moron," but
Yeah.
there are
Uh-huh.
80,000,000 people that are listening to them,
Yeah.
now believe that, there's no Holocaust or
Yeah.
whatever other crazy historical non-fact exists out there.
Well, I think it helps if you understand why they do it. They're doing what people have always done. They're making things up. The 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 good part of that is that we as a species evolved through storytelling. Storytelling is not a bad thing. Storytelling, even tall tales is how we bond together as a species since we've been, hanging around campfires together. We've been telling stories. So that instinct is, is so wired into us. That's what we do. But a lot of people use that now for evil reasons, to twist and to lie. Um, and I'm seeing this right now. You forgive me for a present rant. AI is backed by huge companies that have invested trillions of dollars. They are invested in trying to change the way people think. They are right now working to change people's habits. They want everybody to rely on AI. They want students to use AI to write their tests, to write their papers. They want them to do that. They won't come out and admit it, but they want them to do it. For why? Because they need a return on their investment. They've invested everything in this. And so, like, I see people like creating AI founding fathers, which I think is one of the biggest lies being perpetrated right now. Creating AI historical figures, you can't do that. That's not real. That's fake. It's fakery, and but they want you to believe it's real because they have money in it. That's why you recognize that. Why do they want me to do this? Why is it every time I write an email, it says, let AI write this email for you? Why is it every time I do a Google search, and I use Google all the time when I'm writing books, because I do introductory research there. Now, the first thing you get is AI giving you these things. And it's mostly wrong, but they want you to go there first. I think if you have that kind of understanding of people and you realize why they're lying and why they're making things up, and there are a lot of other examples besides AI, Holocaust deniers or other people making things up. If you recognize their motivations, then you can filter it out. When I was in high school, I remember taking a class on the media, and they would teach us things like, here's why advertisers lie to you, and here's how they lie to you. Man, that was one of the best classes I ever took because it makes me skeptical. And I can say, yeah, I know that when they say 50% less, I can say 50% less than what? We've dropped our prices by 30%. Okay, but did you hike them by 30% before that? you know, if you get that habit in your mind, I think you can you know, not even necessarily be outraged by it, but you can filter out a lot of the noise and the churn. So,
Yeah, I think I do a decent job of that, but it still just drives me wild that I see things like the Holocaust denial and what I mean.
yeah.
That's just one of many instances of historical. I don't even want to. Historical non-education. I don't even know what you call it. Just historical incompetence. Maybe that's what a better term.
Well, I've fallen for stuff too. There's no shame in falling for it sometimes, but I think the key is to understand, wait, do these people have a reason for telling you the story that they want you to believe?
Yeah, and
Um,
there's that, and there's also people that do believe the Earth is flat or
well,
whatever,
yeah,
you
there
know? There's
are. I mean,
a
some
mix of the 2.
people, but it's part of the human story. Some people arise from a kind of fanaticism or a narrow mindset, or they have to believe it for their own reasons. They like to be in this little group of believers that nobody else knows what we know, kind of thing. And
Academia has a fair share of that type of
yeah,
mentality as well in terms of elitism and saying that they're the only ones that know things, which is clearly not true.
absolutely.
What do you think about this current this I don't know if this is recent or what, where people need to comment on everything and they need to be a subject matter expert on everything and their opinion matters on everything. LeBron James, what do you think about, this in politics? Or, you know, football player, what do you think about Donald
Yeah,
Trump? It's like football player, like just can
yeah,
he ask the guy about football? And that obviously bleeds into history and I think spreads a lot of the historical incompetence.
it does. Yeah, it's a product of the media world we live in and social media. Social media is the tool. As an independent historian, I have to advertise stuff, on
Mhm.
Facebook or LinkedIn, which is pretty much all I use. I don't go into. I went into what was once Twitter for a little while, and it was such a cesspool that I had to get out. Um, because of ignorant people who have to comment on everything, and these Twitter mobs, they're God, I hate them. It's so disgusting. It brings out the worst in people. And I think, the people commenting on everything from ignorance is, a product of this media world. People going out and chanting from the river to the sea, and they don't even know what it means.
Right.
Um,
You're talking about genocide is
yeah,
what you're saying.
people say genocide. This is genocide. If somebody goes out, a policeman knocks you on the head, and you scream, "It's genocide! It's genocide!" They don't even know what genocide is.
Right.
But you get people, here maybe I'm going too far down a rabbit hole, but I'm going to say it
Oh,
anyway.
no.
People
Let's
are
go.
tearing down statues, and they don't even know who the statue is of.
What do you
They
think
don't know
about that
anything about him.
as a historian when people go out there and they're tearing down, you know, Lincoln? Like, does that just make your blood boil?
It is, and I was living in New Orleans. I was at the National World War II Museum when this kind of was a craze and reached a crescendo, and I thought there was a very highly symbolic moment. In Lafayette Park, Lafayette Square in New Orleans, there's a statue of this educator, 19th century educator, who had given money to New Orleans schools, white man, of course, and he had some children around him. This was a statue. There's statues of children reaching up to him and holding his hand, and he was standing there. And somebody somewhere discovered he had said something in 1892 or whenever, I'm making up the date,
Gosh,
something
very.
disparaging of black people, right? And so they came out in the middle of the night and they tore down the statue and threw it on the river. And for a while, I would walk by that and I saw what was left there. There was a pedestal and there were children reaching up to nothing.
Mm,
And I thought, this right here, this encapsulates the what this is. You're not giving us anything. You people are tearing down the statues. You don't have any philosophers. You don't have any poets. You don't have any leaders, anybody we can look up to. You're just like, we don't like that. They're bad. We're going to tear them down. Well, wait, why were they bad? Why did they say what they say? Why did they do what they do? Why did they do what they did? Maybe they did what they did for the same reasons you're doing what you're doing: stupidity, passing emotion, rage, hatred, greed, because they're people. Well, they're people like you.
And
But they
see,
don't want to
you know
go
what the
that
vibe
far.
was. See? Knowing the vibe, understanding the feeling,
Yeah.
what's going on in that era. I used to live in Wilmington, North Carolina, which is an awesome city on the coastal North Carolina, southeast coast of North
Yeah.
Carolina.
Yeah.
And we had a bunch of these Daughters of the Revolution statues all over downtown. And while this was happening, of course, they had to remove all the statues and put them into a museum or something like that. So now you have all these, just like you're saying, empty pedestals
Yeah. It's
on
empty
the
pedestals.
street where you had these nice, beautiful statues that were funded, and it's just silly and kind of ridiculous. How do we let these, like, how can no one be an adult? Can no one say, yeah, this is stupid. Don't do that. You touch the statue, you're going to jail.
Yeah.
I don't understand this whole thing where we just let people deface these things and take them down, but we don't need to go too far down that rabbit hole. What's one surprising fact about the White House that nobody thinks about?
Well, I'll kind of focus on something that is related to what's happening right now. What a lot of people don't realize is that, and I talked a lot about Washington and Jefferson, the founders had a specific intention for what that should be. And they intended it to symbolize a certain thing. Um, and they intended it to be a house, a fine house, even a grand house, but still a house that was the resident of the first, the first of Americans. The chief executive. They were very deliberate about that, and it was a compromise between Washington and Jefferson, who hated each other's guts and disagreed totally politically, but it was a compromise. And I think that's something that's very important, that it and that's what I said. I've been in the media a lot recently about that. To me, it's not an issue of, historical preservation even. It's not like, oh, we can't change this. You can't do anything to it because it's sacrosanct. That's not my point of view at all. My point of view is it's got to symbolize a certain thing because the founders had a certain intention, and it was very important. It's just like I believe in the Constitution. I do. I think it's one of the finest documents ever created in the history of the world. And the founders, and I think our nation is the greatest nation in the history of the world. I love our system of government. The founders intended it for a certain thing, and we, I think we ignore founding intent for something as important as this at our peril. Um, I'm an originalist, and that goes for the legal side too. I like that the Supreme Court justices, interpret original intent, and they don't say, "Oh, the founders don't matter anymore. We got to update this." No, the founders do matter. What they intended does matter. So
So what
that's my opinion
what
on the
was
White
the
House.
what was the intent? Like, if you had to summarize the intent of the founders for the White House, like, what was the how would you summarize that?
The intent, they considered and specifically rejected the idea that it would be a palace. Specifically said it is not a palace.
Is it safe
Um,
to say that palaces don't have or palaces have ballrooms?
you have entertainment. You have entertainment, but the entertainment, and Washington was very particular about this, has got to be a certain circumscribed type of entertainment. It needs dignity, it needs gravitas, and accessibility, and the idea that this is the house that belongs to the people, um, was very important to them. Now, in their day, they believed, yeah, you can just walk in and sit down in the waiting room and say, I want to see the president. We can't do that anymore. I understand that, but it's still the idea of it belonging to everybody and not being a place that is walled off, where the very wealthy and the very powerful will have big parties there, and we're not part of that. Jefferson in particular would have lost his mind over this. So I think change, better entertainment, absolutely. You know, National Trust for Historic Preservation said, yeah, we agree. We need better entertainment space there. Um, absolutely, but let's do it in a way that is consistent with the idea this is primarily a residence. The ballroom should not overshadow the residence. I think that's one thing.
Definitely will.
It will, and, you know, I don't think the country's gonna fall to pieces
No.
because of this. I was on Finnerty on Newsmax talking about this. I thought, "Man, they're gonna give me hell over this," um, because I was critical of it, you know, and they're very supportive of the ballroom, as are many Trump supporters are supportive of the ballroom, and I was like, "I'm not outraged about this,
Right.
but I think it's wrong." And I think the key is this is not consistent with a conservative worldview to say we need a gigantic ballroom. This is a radical act and is untethered from the founders' intent. That's my point of view. This is not a conservative decision. This is a radical decision.
I would
And
say it's one of many marks that Donald Trump will leave on history, but more
it
than
will.
we could talk about
It's
all the other stuff, but that's just obviously, like, that's him. You go to Las Vegas and you see Trump Tower, big golden
yeah,
tower in the middle of that's
yeah,
just, like, that's him, and that's his mark on history,
yeah.
and, um but yeah, we want the house to be humble. It almost can't be anymore though. You mentioned that they had an idea of it being like a waiting room. That's coming.
I don't think humble so much as, and I don't think even Washington or Jefferson thought it should be humble, but more like it is a residence,
Yeah. Okay.
you know, and it
That's
is
where he works,
consistent with
right?
the I'm sorry?
That's where the president works too. So it's like,
Yeah.
yeah,
It's a place of work, but it is also primarily a residence, and it must be dignified and consistent with the, you know, with the chief executive. And I'm and this is another thing. Oh, you know, these people are saying they hate everything Trump does. That's not my point of view. I think he's done some good things. I think he's done some things that are not so good. And I'm a conservative, and I think that in many ways this is not a conservative administration. And you know that can be good, bad, or indifferent. But this is one place. This is not a conservative act. This is a reshaping of founders' intent. And it's funny, of my conservative friends, and I have a lot of them, they say, well, what, you know, don't the founders need to be updated? And I say, yeah, a lot of progressive legal theorists would agree with you on that. You know, it's ironic, um, but it's going to happen.
yeah,
It's going to happen. So, I mean, I'm not losing any sleep over it because he's going to do what he's going to do. And, you know, we'll adjust.
yeah.
History goes on.
Yeah, as it does. Um, so then, should I even ask about the UFC at the White House and what you think about that?
That yeah, and I do need to end with this,
All right.
but I think people say, "Oh, you know, what did he do to the Oval Office and paving the Rose Garden and the UFC?" And I can say, you can say that's tasteless, but Bill Clinton did a lot of tasteless things on the White House too. I totally concede that. So did Warren G. Harding. So did many others. But those are all things, and you can some of what Obama did in decorating the White House was really pretty ugly. And those things can be changed. They can be taken down. And UFC is not dignified. I think, you know, a lot of presidents, the founders included, would have said, what? You know, no, don't do that. But, you know, it is what it is. I'm more concerned about changing the nature of the building into something it was not before. I think you're entering a brave new world there. So So I gotta finish with that, but it's been a great conversation.
No, well, thank you so much for joining me. I'm really glad to have spoken to you. I could probably sit here for another 5 hours and ask you questions because there's so
Yeah,
many
some
to
great
unpack.
questions.
But, what I'd like people to do is just check out your website,
Yep.
edwardglengel.com. I'm gonna put the link in the description so everybody can just go down there, click the link, buy all of his books. You have a new one you're working on, right?
Yeah, I have. So this year, I have an Audible original called "The 10 Days to Victory" that come out in December about Trenton and Princeton. My biography of Audie Murphy should hopefully be coming out later this year, and I also wrote a book, a pure military history of the French imperial conquest of North Africa in the 19th century and early 20th century. We could talk about imperialism. I could say a lot of things that would turn some people's ears red because I have strong opinions about that. But um, I think it's a part of our history, human history, we need to recover. So those are the things I'm working on. A lot more to come.
So stay up to speed with Ed and, check out the link in the description. My name's Nick. Appreciate you.
Thank you, Nick. I enjoyed it.